Welcome to On the Couch Conversations with the Warehouse. We are a non-profit organization based in Cape Town, South Africa, passionate about societal transformation through an engaged and justice-centered church. We believe that Jesus is never disengaged from pain, oppression, or injustice, and as such, neither should we be. Join us on a journey to explore what it means to emulate his ways of being within our context today.
Welcome to this On the Couch session that we started, where we as the Warehouse are engaging around matters of the presence of the local church. For us as the Warehouse, we're driven by this vision of us bearing witness to the good news of Jesus by actively living out the peace and justice of God for the world. And so exploring what does that mean for the local church in its local place. And very often when we talk about the church, we sometimes reflect on it as individuals, that we are all individuals and therefore part of the church, or we reflect on it in terms of big institutions, big denominations. And so what do we think about as members of local churches and as congregations and neighborhoods? And so this evening, I'm delighted to welcome you and welcome our guests, Lester, Fiona, and Katlego, to a conversation about the local church and its particular role in disaster response and mitigation. And we're going to spend some time this evening in a hopefully fairly informal but informed way talking about that. So we're going to jump right in. Welcome, everybody. And I thought we would start by doing a bit of a round of introductions with the panel, with Katlego, Fiona, and Lester, just to tell us a little bit about who they are and their particular work, and perhaps particularly as it's related to disaster response and mitigation. So Katlego, do you mind kicking us off?
Okay. Hi, guys. My name is Katlego, also known as Kat. I am I'm the youth and children's pastor, I guess, at the Church of the Khayalitsha, at the Church of the Nazarene in Khayalitsha. So we're based in Khayalitsha. And yeah, we do a lot of work in the community. I think a lot of our work has just been not only like disaster management, but also thinking of like building long-term structures to alleviating poverty, I guess.
Thank you, Katlego. Thank you. Fiona.
Good evening, everybody. My name's Fiona Boshoff, and probably my best qualification is that I'm married to a South African and lived, and both of my boys were born in Cape Town, but then my husband's job took us to Belgium. And during lockdown last year, we moved to England. So it's been quite an interesting journey. I'm British by background. And yeah, had a wonderful 5 years when I married Yaku in South Africa. And he's actually on a flight on his way to Cape Town at the moment, which is why I might have another little visitor coming during this evening, for whom I apologise. I work for an alliance called Integral, and that is 21 Christian international NGOs that work in over 90 countries around the world. And in our alliance, we add value to those NGOs by bringing them together when a disaster happens, to provide a neutral platform for them to come together with their different callings and their different giftings in what they do, and to see how we can do better together than apart. So I'm not so much in the grassroots level, although I was involved with a bit of the very early days of Respond through meeting with Craig and with Deborah Hancock, and then a group of the most phenomenal people in Cape Town who, through their churches, work in disasters. So yeah, I said to Craig, I don't really think I should be here because I don't have all the experience that probably all of you have through your churches, but I'm passionate about people working together and bringing their giftings together, that we multiply what God has given us to be better together.
Well, Fiona, we're grateful for you joining us tonight. Thank you, and very excited to have you on the call. Lester.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I think the name says it all, Lester of Respond. I I am privileged. I am immensely privileged after having served within the context of supply chain management for probably 28 years, to finally be more full-time within the context of what I term missional engagements. And so I hold to the principle that where the world speaks of disasters, we as God's people refer to it more as a missional opportunity or missional engagement type of thing, and just kind of change the perspective a little bit. Married, 18 and a half, 19 years almost, father of two, and just being blessed to be able to serve within the context of that which is the warehouse as the respond catalyst on a full-time basis. And I look forward to this evening's conversations. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mr. Fiona and Katlego. I'm excited about this conversation because I think the three of you bring together these different moments of how the church in its kind of global sense, as well as in the church in its very kind of local sense, respond to moments of crisis. And in thinking about this evening's conversation, we wanted to start with where we often do start when we talk about this kind of work, which is to deliberately distinguish between disaster response and long-term poverty engagement. And that very often for those of us, particularly those of us who have resources, the day-to-day lived experience of the disaster that is poverty. So the lived experience of people in Cape Town who every day are struggling to find food, or every day struggling to do what they need to do, is a disaster in a kind of sociological sense of the word, but isn't in terms of the ways we're talking about disasters here, and the kinds of strategies that one employs in thinking about disaster response and mitigation is often not only unhelpful, but sometimes damaging when applied in the long term in addressing poverty alleviation. So when we talk about disasters, we're generally referring to a distinct incident that may happen instantly or over time. So an earthquake or a fire, as often happens in Cape Town, or perhaps a drought, or like we had with Cape Town Day Zero a number of years ago, where this thing slowly emerges, and where that incident is threatening life and property and health of people in a manner that's beyond their capacity to deal with on their own. And so we have these incidents that happen that threaten people's lives, threaten people's property, threaten people's health, and that moment is bigger than they're able to deal with on their own. And at that moment, we implement disaster response initiatives. But within some of the networks, there are very clear parameters as to what happens. But in our experience with churches, often we like the crisis. Like is the wrong word, but there's an instinctive kind of like people are hungry, we need to feed them. And we get confused between those two things, and they do dance together. They are something that integrates well together, but we do need to be clear about that. And so Fiona, perhaps in starting with you, as you've noted, you work with these Christian agencies around the world, for the most part, I think, collaborating on large scale incidents. And I imagine that most of the time, although disasters don't only happen in poorer communities, very often for them to be big enough to exceed the capacity of the local community to respond, they often are poor communities. I think you're currently involved in Haiti, if I'm not mistaken. How do you and your agencies think about the difference between these two things, about what is our role in disaster response versus what is the role of sometimes the same agencies on the ground doing long-term poverty alleviation? How do you hold those two together?
Yeah, thanks, Craig. I think the phrase that you used about these disaster incidents being greater than the capacity of the community to be able to cope with it, that's the important phrase, is that these are extraordinary times and things that happen in a community. So as you mentioned, things like fires and floods and those kinds of things, whereas the ongoing callings of churches into long-term chronic needs of community is something quite different. But as you say, I like the phrase they dance together. So the majority of our members, our 21 members, don't work in disasters, but they have long-term development work and work with partners on the ground all over the world. And that is really important in the way that we respond, because I'm sure for those of you who've been following some of the localization debates and discussions and some of the decolonization of aid, there is this sort of idea of white savior flying into a disaster around the world. And thankfully, that's beginning to change, because actually the capacity of people who are already embedded in their communities, who know the people in their communities, is phenomenal. And the church is, I mean, the Christian mafia is phenomenal around the world in what it can do. And I don't think that any INGO that is part of our alliance would ever say that they could do it without what's happening in the local community. But I think what there is when it hits the media, there is more giving happens. And because of that, what we're trying to do is pull down those resources that come in after a big media crisis. For example, Afghanistan at the moment, where we're responding, or Haiti, although funding for that is not great, and really try and bridge that gap between Christians in the minority world and Christians in the majority world, and trying to bring resources to where there are needs.
Thank you. That's really great. I mean, Lester, in a different way, you're operating here, and both in the Western Cape and nationally. You know, over the last year, you were involved in some of the COVID responses, and in whether it's food relief and very often in large and smaller scale fires. And so I know that as you work particularly with local churches, how do you and how do you respond to help churches recognize the difference between what's the work we do in response to this distinct moment, and how does that relate to, as we're now using the word, dance with the other work that happens, the other ministry that happens longer term in the community? What are some of the ways you and Respond help churches think about that?
Well, thank you, Craig. It's become what I've noticed, an ongoing sort of evolutionary conversation all the time with pieces. Number of our partners particularly have been, challenged in the way in which they want to do what the general terminology is food relief. And of course, we've begun to challenge that and say it's not only the food relief aspect. Yes, it's one part of the whole. Kind of just backtracking almost a little bit as well. What I've discovered, which I'm pretty much joyful for, is that the gifting of the church begins to find itself in the spaces of, and what I term the depth of the strength of the partnerships or the collaborations that do exist in themselves. And there's a natural tendency almost of individuals and churches and organizations to want to do good, generally speaking. And some of them understand that they can only do as much as what their physical resources allow them to do. And so it's in that conversations really that we begin or I particularly begin to challenge certain thinkings, and I begin to ask and probe certain questions to understand what it is that those particular churches or those organizations can then begin to say, this is what we have in our hands. This is all we have. And it's a gift. It's a privilege for me to be able to serve, or what is ecumenically speaking in itself, being able to know who else is in the system with regards to our partners, and then to tie up those individuals so that the strength of the synergy comes through particularly well within the context of a particular incident. But to come back to the question also of the difference between short-term relief and the development side of things as well. Many of the partners, right, or our collaborative members or collaboration members are beginning to understand that there's a clear, distinct difference between medium to long-term development what does that entail specifically, as opposed to the short-term relief aspect in itself, and what can be done on a niche basis, particularly to serve a community that has been negatively impacted at that moment in time. Literally, one person put it as, what can they give? What is the smallest thing that they can give that has the biggest impact for the relief aspect, so that they can then begin to focus on other long-term development aspects of that particular community where they are presently engaged in itself. And so just, going back to where we were at just last year, and Craig was integral, sorry, choose the pun, Fiona, with the food vouchers, the digital food voucher campaign, which was called the Hope Voucher campaign, or the Hope Voucher initiative in itself. That's the word I'm looking for. And that turned out quite well. One of the key things there, particularly the tension that I held last year, was, yes, there was a food crisis as a direct result of the lockdown, as a result of the current pandemic that we're still faced with. But at the heart of this was a health crisis type of thing. And for me, the gift was to be able to listen to all the parties involved and to understand their strengths, and to be able to separate those individuals so that a pertinent result, almost, and a pertinent gifting of, and a steering of the gifting of individuals could then happen in itself. So there was just huge efforts being put in by the church ultimately. I want to pause there. I could wax lyrical about it.
Thanks, Lester. So very similarly to Fiona, this recognizing that local partnership, that working locally and understanding your particular role in disaster response versus the role of locals, and trusting the role of locals in that, which is a good pivot moment to chat with Katlego. I mean, Katlego, you are a local church leader. When you introduced yourself, you sort of spoke about, oh, I'm the youth worker, but I also know enough to know the story of your life and your whole witness. That you minister in a context that one might describe as a disaster just in its day-to-day lives. And that's not to diminish the people or the assets or the reality, but when we live in a city as unequal as ours, the context, the street in which your church is and the blocks around them have a level of need that is equal probably to many places where we would describe it as a disaster that needs addressing. And yet, there are moments where that becomes profoundly worse because of an incident that happens, a fire, a plague, a pandemic. And I'd love to hear from you, as someone who kind of has lived in that space, being involved in food relief, being involved in fire relief. How do you hold that tension between these immediate things that draw attention? Fiona mentioned that draw attention, and yet there's the long, slow burn. How do you handle that as someone in the midst of it? And that for the rest of us could pay attention to.
With us, I mean, it's a tension that we constantly have conversation about. Me and Zakani is my pastor, and because you don't want, I think one of the things we talk that is important is you don't want people to be stranded after the relief is gone, because the relief is only like short term. And so with the example that Lester used of the food relief last year, we also got involved with that. And we also had we also partnered with the warehouse doing food vouchers. We partnered with other organizations as well, and we were able to do food parcels and stuff in response to the food security because of the things that were happening in the community. But for us, it was like, how do we introduce a conversation so that this is like a long-term thing? Like, how do we make it sustainable? And so what we did was we have a hub. We have a hub where we train young people, because we want to we want to empower them holistically. So then with the young people that we had, we then started the conversation of food security with them. We brought in people like Munwabisi and Zukile came. They did a presentation on food security, on like food gardens, what home gardens might look like, and thinking about home industries even. And that also is another conversation on its own, because then we get to think about creating employment opportunities and stuff like that. But that's just an example of, and then we started a food garden at the church where we, and people have been eating from that garden in the community. So people have been coming, we're resurrecting the garden again. But that's just an idea of this long-term thing, because then with the people that were there, some of them were inspired to actually start food gardens at their own homes. But then with the conversation that was brought in by Munwabisi, like, and Zukile, when they came in, when they talked about the, the possibilities of, for instance, logistics, of transport, of marketing, that the food industry is huge. Like, people were very excited about that, because it was like, oh, we can actually create something of our own and become self-reliant, and start to think about sorting out our own problems, among ourselves. That's one example. Another thing that we did was, at the beginning of COVID, like in the township, everyone lives on top of each other, right? And so the biggest threat obviously was how infection would spread. So initially, because at our church, we have quite a large space. And so we were thinking of turning our church into an isolation center. But then when we were thinking about, like, in terms of sustainability, we didn't think that that was quite sustainable, just because obviously, like with the isolation center, you can only have a certain number of people, and then setting the place up and whatever, we didn't really have the resources for that. But what we then had an idea to do was to partner with local leaders, have the young people trained. So we partnered with Doctors Without Borders, with the Department of Health in the Western Cape, and then we had them train then the young people from within the community, and then do COVID education in the community. And so for us, that was like a more sustainable thing in dealing with a disaster and mitigating COVID within the community. And the results of that have been quite evident in terms of just like what we know without that intervention, what we know the infection rate would have looked like without the intervention, if it makes sense.
Yeah. Thank you, Katlego. That's amazing. I love how you're articulating this, leveraging the crisis to get people to think about some of the longer side. So you meet the initial need, but you're growing that. And so hopefully I'm not putting words into everybody's mouths from this conversation, but maybe just to pull out what I've noticed, and for those who are listening now and end up listening on the video. So as we think about the local church in disaster, this reminder that we're dealing generally with a distinct event, even if it is slow burning or incident that is beyond the capacity of the local community to address, rather than the ongoing context. And then in our response, to be thinking about things like, well, who are the local partners that we can invest with and come alongside, to recognize even in that moment that there are assets and strengths that exist in the local community, and particularly in the context we're talking about, local churches that are present and will be present in the months to come and have been present in the years to come. And so their assets and their strengths and their ministries can be strengthened. Secondly, that we can be thinking about specific responses. Sometimes I imagine in some of Fiona's, where they're dealing with very, very large scale, where it's water and sanitation, and it's food and it's shelter, all of those things are held very often in our local context. And we can identify specific needs that can be addressed that are distinct and deliberate and have context. And so to be thinking about that as to what that would look like. And thirdly, implicit in some of what's been said is that these responses can be time bound. That you're not wanting to do this response forever. I know, Lester, with Respond, I think we talk about a few weeks response from incident moment to when the Respond participation steps away, and then we can go for it. And then lastly, and then I'm going to ask Fiona to comment, is I think, listening particularly to you, Katlego, this need to keep the bigger picture in mind. That fires, for example, fires in Cape Town don't happen to some communities and not to others. That there's a broad socio-historic context in which that happens, and that we need to be cognizant of that. And we need to be cognizant of the context going forward into the future. So those bits and pieces. Fiona, do you want to jump in and add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that in the sort of NGO sector, one of the things that has been measured is to say that for every $1 that's spent on disaster risk reduction and mitigation, they say it saves 7 in a relief or a repairs kind of way. So the fact, so planting a garden in Khayalitsha might cost $1, but it will save 7 if somebody has to come in and be fed from outside. And I was just thinking, as you were summarising, Craig, about this journey that we're taking people on. And sometimes the short term, the thing that hits the news that everybody says, oh, we need to give or we need to do something. If we can engage them to join the journey of mitigating and preparing so that things don't reach a disaster time, I really feel that the church could be really sort of central and key in being able to do that. It's lovely to hear what's happening in Cape Town, but I think the more that churches can, rather than wait to respond to something that hits the news, be feeding into a journey of journeying with people to build them up, to see what can be done, the better. And it gives people much more dignity and a word that's being used a lot at the moment, agency, because, to go in and give people sandwiches or make food, if you've had a disaster, but you're still in your home, you might still be able to make food. So to be able to empower people to respond in their own communities, and do what they're good at, and to be able to do things more sustainably, I think is a lovely way to be working with the community around us. And following the Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, there's so much money came into that disaster that we set up a fund that we asked local churches to just give quite a short proposal about what they were already doing and what they would like to do in their own communities. And we were able to give out small grants through the money our members gave us to Stewart to be able to go and support those kinds of things. So some communities, well, I mean, it's the Philippines, they went and bought water buffaloes, and some set up little shops in their communities. Some did cooking and sold meals, but the people's responses, you could never have come up with the extent of the things people wanted to do. I certainly wouldn't have gone in saying, why don't we go and buy some water buffalo? But, it's just amazing to see people finding and telling us why they were doing that, because once the water buffalo has a baby, they can sell the baby, that will pay for the first water buffalo they'll be able to, and just people's ingenuity and being able to use the resources that they have and give them dignity to do it in their way was just a real privilege to watch and be alongside.
I love that idea of small grants that can be activated in those moments. Thanks, Fiona. That's I've scratched a note for myself about future possibilities. Yeah, I want to pivot. One part of this conversation, and there was a question earlier about we are recording this conversation, and we will make it available on YouTube, so it will be available for sharing down the line. The second, to move into that, and Fiona started taking us there in terms of the conversation around the local church congregation. I think many of us, or some of us, are involved in denominations that have big agencies involved, but we do want to zoom in on this local church that buys a water buffalo, so it'll give birth to another one and start something. How do local congregations get involved in disaster response and mitigation for incidents, both at their local community, but also on large-scale global impacts? How do we participate in the story of bearing witness to God's news God's good news in these particular moments? And so, Katlego, I wanted to jump in with you as the person most visibly representing the local church here. You know, you're in a local church that has responded both to the long term as well as to discrete incidents. You did a lot last year. You continue to do a lot. I'd love to hear from you. My question is twofold for you. What do you think the particular gift of the local church in the community is in thinking about disaster response and mitigation? And then secondly, how do those of us, and particularly how do churches outside your community best support churches like yourselves in doing this work?
Let me start first with the churches outside. Now, I think the churches outside, the first thing, the most important thing, I would say partnerships, partnering with churches like us and proximity, right? Because we can't exactly tell you how to respond. But when we have a relationship that is growing organically, the closer you are, the more you see what the issues are, the more or the easier it will be for you to respond. So I would say, and so that and advocacy, right? I think, Craig, you mentioned, I like that you laid that down earlier on, that Cape Town, for instance, is heavy laden with the residues of our violent history in South Africa. And in the context that I find myself in, like, you know, like the ripple effects of those structures are there. And that's part of why we are in this disaster. And so I would say that advocacy from churches that are outside of our context, because they would be churches where people, of the people that pay. And so those people then are much more, have a voice in the sense of advocacy. So in terms of like contesting some of the policies that the city comes up with, like last year in Cape Town, we were having the city was like demolishing people's homes, right? But then it's like people in these contexts have a bigger voice, or they are much more likely to be listened to when they start to contest some of the decisions that the city makes and stuff like that. So I would say yes, advocacy, partnerships, intercession just in practical ways. Yes, we are praying with each other and we're working with each other, but like also practically, and also like in terms of resources, churches that are able to, that have a bit more resources, could partner with churches that are like under-resourced. And I think I like what Fiona mentioned earlier on, just with, the example that she used about missionaries jumping into like the disaster reliefs. So even in your partnering like with resources, also like being mindful of how that relationship also plays out, being aware of power dynamics is also very important, because so I think the gist of it is partnerships, really. And then in terms of the gift of the local church in our context, I think that church can be looked at as a safe space. I think the church can be looked at as a safe space, especially like in our context. I'll talk about in our community, like every week, literally every week, someone at our church will be talking about like, oh, like someone died in my street, there was a gang shooting, there was this. And so coming to church is like a safe space because this is where I find comfort. So not only spiritually, but like just, I don't know, like people look at church as a place of safety. And so I think that in itself is a gift, not only for us as Christians to be able to witness to others, but then that also gives us an opportunity to respond to some of the issues that are in our communities, because there is already that kind of position, for lack of a better word, that the church holds in the community.
Thanks, Katlego. That's amazing. There's about 1 million questions I have, but I'm only going to ask one of them. And I specifically want to put out your word partnership, because I think it's a word that we use quite easily. And so you use it and I hear something and maybe we mean two different things. And so when your first response was partnership, what do you mean as a church leader in Khayalitsha when you say the first thing we need to do is partnership? What do you mean by that?
Okay, yes. I think when I say partnership, I mean like a relationship where, okay, I need to say this, a relationship where both of us are equal, right? So although, I don't want to say like relying, well, I don't have but where there must be like equality, because it's also not, or at least in my idea, it's not a thing that the other church is coming, we are like under like your wing type of thing. Yeah, like I don't know if it makes sense, right? So I think in my idea of partnership is where both of us can grow in relationship, like where we can sharpen each other. Obviously, like there's stuff that we can learn from you, there's stuff that you can learn from us. But I think just an organic relationship where both of us are equal in the relationship, but we can, I don't know, like we can sharpen each other in our relationship and speaking into each other's context. I think we can explore together, because we are so different, that we can explore together. Or for me, the ideal relationship looks like us together exploring how do we move towards the South Africa that we all envision. I don't know if that makes sense.
That's great. And I think if I'm hearing you saying part of that is that there's a partnership before a disaster happens, and maybe speaks to Fiona's disaster risk reduction, that one of the ways we can reduce our risks is by having these partnerships in play, rather than when a moment happens, I get in my bakkie and I drive down to Khayalitsha to come save, that actually I've got some context to do that. I know that never happens. I'm just using it hypothetically. Lester, let's jump to you. You know, you're working with local churches all the time. You're working at denominational level, but your focus is on how do we help local congregations, both churches in communities that are most vulnerable to disaster incidents, as well as communities that are less vulnerable and are perhaps more resourced. What do you think are some of the ways in which local churches, what are the steps they can take to prepare themselves to be involved in this work effectively? And perhaps the second part of that is, what can they do that's actually harmful in the context?
Okay. Thank you, Craig. Katlego, I just had a conversation just this morning, in fact, both Mwabisa and myself, with the Anglican Church that's in your general vicinity. And so the very discussion on what you term partnerships and the terminology we're using are the local ecumenical action networks kind of conversations that we fostering and continue to nurture, noting that the Anglican Church has a building right next door to you guys was just an amazing aspect. So yeah, I'm just so keen on that conversation. Yeah, just to backtrack a little bit, obviously, Craig, with regards to what the local churches can do, certainly what I prefer and what we push for is this position of training, particularly. It's a key component for us, simply because I would hate to have individuals of churches who literally become volunteers in those particular moments run headlong into an incident not almost understanding what their role is. So it's a critical component to be informed in that moment of crisis, to have the conversations within the context of your local parish or congregation in itself, so that informed decisions are being made. And so certainly part of the training that we do as Respond members is to encourage training of volunteers. It's a critical piece of the work. Inevitably what we do find, and this is sort of general practice I see, is that when individuals who are coming into a situation, who are coming from the outside in with the aim of wanting to assist, it is what I've found almost on every occasion, that you find children coming and running up and wanting to hug and touch the stranger kind of thing. And so there's those moments of, and I think Katlego also mentioned the safe spaces. And I was thinking about the green spaces conversation that we had just about a week ago. And I'm thinking the tendency of individuals coming from the outside to want to take photographs. And there's those particular laws in terms of children, children's acts, etc., that one need to be very careful of. But one can get caught up in the situations. And so training is a key component for us as the Respond Coalition particularly, and to continue those conversations almost in the in-between moments of the historical moments or seasons, particularly when disaster or crisis moments does tend to occur, probably in our winter periods and in our summer lead-up periods as well. One of the key things that I also try and mention in the context of our trainings, particularly, and general conversations, noting that we have Christian-based agencies and churches, particularly in the same space of humanitarian relief or humanitarian assistance, as some people always use the wording, is that I always remind them that every corner is worthy of the presence of Jesus Christ. And that begins to shift the paradigm of how do we do this, and how do we do this better together. And so it is in this context of the depth of the strength of the synergies that we as Respond build and constantly work at, so that the partnerships, as Katlego uses the word, become strengthened, that we listen to one another. A good strength of any leader is to listen. And so we learn to have that art of listening, particularly as well, within the context of the local ecumenical action networks, particularly, that is being groomed and being surfaced more and more. Yeah, let me just leave it at that.
Thank you, Lester. We'll pick up something about whether you know anybody that can help people who need training in Cape Town. But Fiona, I'd love to jump to you then, and particularly to have this conversation about large-scale incidents. And most recently in Southern Africa, we had Cyclone Idai. You and I had a couple of conversations, and I joked about sort of mostly men and their buckies running into Khayalitsha, but it actually was true that I think to some extent, in what I understand, what may have happened occasionally with Haiti, with North America so close, we had playing out in Southern Africa, where everybody who thought they could help threw a bunch of clothes on the back of their pickup truck and headed north. So obviously these large incidents, they draw media attention, but they also are big things that need global support in many ways. And so I'd love to hear from your experience. If I'm a local church here in Cape Town, here in South Africa, or anywhere in the world, what's the best way to get involved with large-scale incidents? And perhaps what should we avoid doing? And I said to you beforehand, feel free to say, send money to a partner and stay away. But perhaps we can expand a little bit on that and just say, what do you think is the best way for us to think about these very large-scale incidents where there are tremendous complexities and possibilities happen? What's the best way we can be involved in those?
Thank you, Craig. I think when something big hits the news, there's a whole sort of engine of disaster response that starts happening, and the very wealthiest UN agencies and Red Cross have what I call helicopter money. They can send the helicopters in, and they can go in and start looking at what's happening and trying to find places for others to land. And then our members would be in that sort of second wave after that of sending early responders in who have skills in things like shelter, water and sanitation, and various other of these sector needs that they'll find in communities. And we will then, once it becomes an integral response, we'll send somebody hopefully seconded from one of our members to go in and help bring together all the people who have partners on the ground. So in a day in Mozambique, we had members who flew in, we had someone who went out on behalf of Integral, seconded from one of our members, who then went and visited all of our members, partners and local organizations on the ground and tried to see where are the needs, what do they need. And then what we try and do is join up our members so that they go out and do needs assessments together. So we might have Medair who would be doing perhaps an audit of health needs. We might have Food for the Hungry who's going to do food security assessments. They might send people in pairs together, go out and do a health assessment and a food security assessment at the same time, so that we're not duplicating visits out. And then they'll link into the UN cluster system and try and draw down and bring all these different levels of people responding together. And I loved the fact that after a day you got in touch with me and said, oh, what could we be doing and how could we be responding? And really, I would say stay away unless you have a really good Portuguese speaker, unless you have someone with a skill that definitely cannot be found in Mozambique in that height of the disaster. Is the person going with their bucky? Have they done needs assessments before? Have they worked in flooded areas? Can they speak fluent Portuguese? Or will they just be putting more strain on a system that's already in crisis? And that's why I never go in when a disaster's happening, because I leave it to the people who are best placed, and send your money to those people that you know are responding on the ground. As I mentioned with a bit of a joke, but there is a Christian mafia pretty much around the world that you can get involved with. And you know, I think the same on a different scale. You know, now that we know Katlego is in Khayalitsha, hooray! We don't need to go in with our buckies when the next fire happens, because through Respond and through Katlego, we have the channels that we can just support. And as I mentioned before, there's huge agency, and with a bit of training, I think local churches can go out and do a load of needs assessment. And I think youth groups and youth are brilliant at that sort of thing. They can go out and get into the corners of the areas in which they live, and they know people, and find out where are the needs, where are the people who are being overlooked because they've got additional needs, or because they're elderly, or because they can't get to where the food's being distributed. So there's so much agency and so much going on in the ground. Yeah, leave your bucky and just send you money.
Thank you, Fiona. So thank you, Fiona. I know you might need to slip away in a moment to go.
Yeah, will you excuse me just to put a small boy into bed, please? I'll be back as soon as I possibly can.
Good luck with that. So if you've got any questions for Fiona, you might have to hold on to them. So folks, as you're listening, in a moment, we'd love to take any questions you might have for any of us on the panel, but maybe just to sense check as we've had this conversation. So I'm listening as someone who's a member of a local church, and what I'm hearing as I think about what can I do. One is this consistent call to form partnership and relationship, to trust the people who are closest to the problem to deal with the problem, but that we need to make sure that we're finding ways of moving and the resources they might need or the support they might need, and that isn't best done in the middle of a crisis. That is best done outside of a particular crisis. Secondly, that we can be investing in training. that not all donated clothing is equal in its ability to reflect the image of God in the world. And I know that it's a very high value for Respond, that when we donate, when we encourage churches to donate clothing, we see it in a particular way. And if you talk to the city of Cape Town, if you talk to many of the disaster professionals in Cape Town, you can sometimes bring them to tears in asking about what it means to manage clothing donations and the immense amount of basically rubbish that arrives. And so training, both in terms of how you do the work of assessment, how you engage in community, how you build collaborations, who are the role players in a disaster response, when does fire hand over to disaster management, who is responsible for home rebuilding kits and who isn't, who handles registrations, those kinds of things are part of training, and that we can do stuff about that. Thirdly, that we can anticipate that many disasters are unfortunately events that we can anticipate. We know that the patterns are there and they happen, and so we can do planning for those, both in terms of mitigating and preventing, as well as being ready to prepare ourselves to do work. And so that's the next bit, is planning, so that we're not making decisions in the midst of the crisis. Many of the decisions have already been made. We're just acting in response to a current context. And so those are some of the ways we as local churches can be thinking about it. And then Fiona's last piece is like when the incident is of any scale, that mostly we shouldn't be rushing in, so to speak, when angels fear to tread. That we should be trusting local, and then we should also be trusting people who've done the work before, who can activate that. And that takes work to decide, and Fiona's not near, but you can go to the Integral Alliance website if you're thinking about global, and there are their global members there as agencies that have agreed to collaborate together and do work in a particular way on the ground. Lester, maybe just before we jump to questions, I know that you and Respond offer training, and so maybe just briefly talk about, if someone here is wanting to get training, what would be the best way for them to connect with you, connect with that training?
Yeah, thank you, Craig. The best way possible at this moment in time is really just to pop me an email. I think that's the key thing. It is, and I'm sure we can pop that in the chat, which is respond@warehouse.org.za. Conversely, my telephone number is available. I'm quite keen on that. I love what I do, so I'm available for anyone to be in touch with me, particularly. I'm sure we'll put that in the chat group hereafter, Craig. Also, just what I wanted to mention as well, just as you were speaking about the roles of churches, there's a particular grouping of churches right now, mainline churches particularly, where part of the gifting of the church, and particularly the church clergy person, has really become part of the role. Their calling surrounds this thing of counseling. And very often we're finding that a number of firemen caught up in a moment sometimes want to just get pulled out of a situation just to kind of debrief. And so some of the churches are beginning to think along those lines as well, that for half an hour, to pull a fireman out of a moment, as an example, even just to offer that moment to say, come apart and just breathe within that space of offering a sort of a green space. Even that can be a gifting of the church, because of the physical presence and what a church building denotes within our present day context. That's quite a key thing as well, that people are beginning to chat around.
Thanks, Lester. So Lester, Ronel is asking, how can we become part of the current Respond Alliance? Maybe talk to that. Ronel, are you in which part of the world are you?
I'm in Pretoria.
Okay. Yeah. So Lester, how would that work, and how could we collaborate?
With Ronel, thank you, Ronel, for that Living Word and Funani Trust. Ronel, best for us to have a conversation. My details are in the chat. Literally what we do is we would, look at who are the current role players within, in your case, the Pretoria side of things, and then to connect you with those individuals, particularly up north. We've got guys that have been with us for several years, the likes of Roger, the likes of Marcus, and the guys as well, who are very much well trained in and around these particular concepts as well, and are familiar with our work in itself as well. So that'll be a keen aspect for me to see you being connected in those spaces, or that are already active in terms of their history with us in itself. That'll be a good thing.
So Renelle, one of the things about the Respond Network is that it's kind of built in layers, if you wish, a little bit like Shrek's onion, in that it seeks to build collaborations at the very local level. So how do a group of churches in a local zone within a city act together to respond to disasters of a reasonable scale within their local community? And then, so in Cape Town, it's at a zone level, and then there's a wider zone for the city. So how do we coordinate the work of churches at a city? And then increasingly provincial. And they are beginning to be the emergence of a national conversation that activated a little bit around COVID, but isn't particularly mature. KZN has a fairly active KZN response. And then there are people in your region, and certainly one of the ways in which Leicester is freed up, or not freed up, it's part of Leicester's work and Monwabise's work, is to help facilitate other networks in other places to offer some of the processes we use, some of the procedures we've utilized, and guidance to help you set up your own network. When Fiona comes back, she can maybe talk to joining Integral Alliance. My understanding of Integral is very much agencies that operate at a global level on some of the very large scale global incidents that you can apply to be a member. But for example, the Warehouse and Respond wouldn't apply to be a member of Integral because we act locally for the most part. But we can always ask Fiona if any of us are wanting to do that. Ronald, I hope that answers your question between Leicester and I. Great, thank you. Anybody else got a question?
Yeah, thanks, Craig. Yes, so I think I said that you mentioned anticipation. I found it quite interesting. So, but then I was thinking, to anticipate, there are many ways that we can help. We can prepare the church. But I think most of the times we have many people in the church during the service. That's what I thought about, really like a sermon. So when one wants to, how can I put it, wants to get the congregation ready, like to prepare people, like to respond to disasters. Yeah, just a silly question. What kind of theme do you come up with in order to
So I'm going to answer mine, and then I'm going to ask Fiona, Katlego, and Leicester to offer their themes for their sermon services. But Daj, I mean, a place I often go to is the story of the Antioch Church in Acts. And off the top of my head, I can't think of a particular reference, but I think it's a fascinating story because it's a church that forms in the midst of human migration. That we're talking about refugees fleeing religious persecution, amongst other things, and they end up in Antioch together in, I think, what would be modern day Syria, and this church forms in this place from a group of people who've ended up there for all sorts of other reasons. So that's the one part of the story, and then what emerges is that this church anticipates a famine. And prepares for the famine and decides to respond to this famine in their region. And I think there, for me, the theme is that it's built into the very DNA of who we are as the people of God. That there's this twofold, that we form in the midst of crisis. That the Antioch church wasn't the sort of powerful status quo of Antioch of the time. They were people who arrived fleeing death and persecution, probably traumatized. And God does this work with them. that they also then, in their coming together in this space of crisis, become those who respond to another crisis by collecting money out of their own probably need and supporting a famine. So Daj, that would be one of the places I would go. Very happy for Katlego, Fiona and Lester to add their themes, because I think it's a great question.
Well, I don't know. I can't think of a theme now, but I probably wouldn't bring this up in a sermon. I think I would probably bring it up like during prayer or something, and like say, guys, what would we do if there was a bomb here, for instance? Like, how would we respond? And so when we're talking about, I would bring it up when we are during intercession, when we are praying about other people who are caught up in disasters. Like, if that were to happen to us, like, how do we prepare for that? Yeah, I think I'd bring it up then, not necessarily during a sermon or.
Lester, Fiona?
Fiona, as our guest, I allow you first privilege.
That's really kind. I'm so pleased nobody else said Nehemiah, because when you're in the NGO sector, there are plenty of people who use Nehemiah as the way to prepare for for rebuilding and clearing out after a disaster. And but the other one that I really like, that we go back to quite a lot in our secretariat when we're praying, is that there's 5 loaves and 2 fish, or a bigger theme actually of what have you got in your hand. So God asks Moses that question. You can see it sort of dotted through scripture. What have you got in your hand? And just using what God has given us, the little that God has given, and multiplying that in the context that he's put us. So that the boy with the 5 loaves of fish, or even Moses saying, but I can't speak. But bring your brother along, he can speak, and that's fine. It's multiplying the gifts that God has given us to do it together.
Thank you. And Fiona, well done. That, as someone who went through that age, I don't think I ever got my children to sleep that quickly. So I'm just in awe at the moment.
He's not asleep.
Listen.
Yeah,
we'll move towards closing up.
I'm just so enthralled by that question. And Fiona, just a while ago, what we're doing, obviously this past week was the International Day of Disaster Risk Reduction, basically, on the 13th. Obviously, it's an annual thing. And in using one of the facets that we try and use down with Respond is that we try and encourage a particular Sunday that is closest to this particular day. And so for us, it was just this past Sunday to use the pulpits as with a central theme towards preparation. More so than the risk reduction, obviously, but to try to interplay that. And so the 2 scriptures that were coming primarily through was Matthew 25. That's the parable of the 10 minas, or virgins, as it's sometimes called. The ability to have oil in your lamp to be prepared, kind of thing. That was kind of coming through a little bit as well in terms of our discernment processes. But then also there was this play on the 2 Timothy chapters, which was, although not contextual, but it was talking about be prepared in season and out of season. And so what does that mean, looking through the lens of a disaster risk facilitator kind of thing? And that was the 2 scriptures kind of thing, Daj, that was coming through particularly. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Lester. So perhaps as we close, Katlego's added Egypt's preparation. Fiona, there was a question about how does Integral work in terms of membership? I know people don't become members, but how does Integral work in that regard? And then maybe as you close out, then what's the best way for people to watch what Integral does, to be supportive of what you do? Perhaps just to name that. We will put any web addresses or anything into a follow-up email after this, but if you can maybe name that, that'd be great. Yes,
thank you. We we are about to rethink our structure, and I think we had our board meetings last week, and I've asked our board, after 16 years working for Integral, if I can have 3 months study leave to look at structures and what to do next, because 16 years ago the world was in a very different place to now, and I would love to see ourselves working towards doing ourselves out of business, and see how we could empower what's happening in Respond and what's happening with REPED in Haiti, or what's happening in Jakomkris in Indonesia, or what's happening with Merath in Lebanon, to be happening around the world, and us to be supporting those kinds of initiatives at a local or national level. So, I mean, that's me dreaming at the moment, but it's great to see the growth of these kinds of responds around the world, and just to see how God is drawing people in their local context to be able to respond, really. And yeah, so I'll be really rethinking and praying and looking at how different networks and alliances work themselves over the next year or so. But I think local is the best. Local knowledge and local agency and resources and all that God has given us is fantastic to see what's happening around the world. Sometimes those things aren't hitting, the disasters that you see aren't hitting the headlines, and so I think there is maybe a role for us to help try and advocate, as Katlego was talking about, that sometimes a voice might be more powerful in a different country, or to be able to speak out on behalf of those who aren't being heard. And we're starting to work in neglected crises. So we've started a project in the Democratic Republic of the Congo that's very difficult to access and get people into, or yeah, so there are a lot of these neglected and hidden crises around the world that I think our members, and through Integral, we're able to respond to and monitor what's happening. So although we're responding to 8 at the moment, we've been monitoring 13 over the last year in places that just aren't hitting the headlines. So yeah, sorry, I don't really know where I'm going with this, but yeah, I'm just still struggling with where do all these different people and levels and things fit in the world as we know it today, and where is there a platform for Christians to band together and do more together? To add on to what Lester was saying about the disaster risk reduction and what you were doing about that, we've just been part of a weekend that World Vision catalysed people to be part of, and it was called the Weekend of Prayer and Action Against Hunger, and that's looking at the fact that COVID and climate change and conflict is causing the gains of people coming out of poverty to be reversed, and we're looking at 41 million people around the world moving into a state of famine. And this is probably the first time I've been able to say that without crying, since we've been looking at those statistics and figures and what's happening around the world. And I do think that we as Christians can raise a powerful voice on behalf of those who are moving into a state of famine. And in the chat, I've just put in the link to the resources that were put together. So liturgy and things for churches to do and to pray about, and some videos to just highlight that, because I don't think on our watch, I don't think in our lifetime, famine should be seen when many of us can choose what we eat today. Why should there be famine? Yeah, so.
Thank you, Fiona. That's excellent. Katlego, how do people connect and see what you're doing, if there's such a thing? Are you on Twitter, websites? What's the best way to?
Oh, you can visit our Facebook page. We're trying to be like active on social media. I mean, we're growing in that. So you can let me put in the chat.
That'd be great.
And you could always visit us. Get involved with the garden, spend a day in the garden or something, like visit us.
La la.
Come.
So in virtual life and in real life, come and
Yes.
participate. Okay. Lester, how do people, you've already put your email address in. What else can people do to connect with you?
Oh, have a look at the website of the warehouse. It's the www.warehouse.org.za. It's an interactive website, and I know it's being monitored as well. And that's one of the other key ways of getting hold of us, particularly, and just to witness some of the work that we do as the warehouse overall, as the one aspect leans into the other overall ultimately, and it's a good ultimate poikikos, almost I want to say, of what we do. Thank you, Fiona, for that laughter.
Thank you, Lester. So to the three of you, thank you so much for participating tonight. I've loved the conversation. I think Simon Peter would have been a lovely addition. So we pray for him and his health. And Simon Peter, I know you're going to listen to this. So we were praying for you, and I do hope that we connect. But Fiona, as an old friend of all of us, a long-time friend, I'm so grateful that you joined us again from home in the midst of putting children down. Thank you so much for all you're doing globally, as well as with us. Katlego, as a partner and friend and co-conspirator, it is wonderful to have you on the call. And Lester, as someone who spends yourself on behalf of those who are impacted by this, I know you stay awake at night making sure that it happens. Thank you to all of you, and thanks to everybody that joins, that's joined this evening and who will be listening. We really appreciate it. One of the realities for us as the Warehouse is that this is the work we do, and the work is made possible by donations from individuals and churches, like many of us on the call. We've spoken of investing in things before they happen. And so the work we do as the Warehouse is to be building the relationships, to be building the collaboration, to be doing the training, that then when things happen, there's networks and capacities of churches present and acting, both in the short and immediate crisis as well as in the long term. One of the things I often say is, if you think about, and I think this is true for pretty much anywhere in the world, but if we think about South Africa and you think about a place that breaks your heart or a place that excites you, if you think about an issue that really grabs you by the throat and makes you cry, or think about a thing that you're excited about, you can choose that place, and somewhere nearby there will be a gathering of people who are following Jesus and are seeking to live out the promise and hope of that, or are seeking to be salt and light in the face of the pain. And our desire as the Warehouse is to strengthen the hands of those people as best we can. And so that's made possible by donations and by investments by people such as yourselves. And I think one of my BC's put the link in the chat. If that's something you're able to do, that would be fabulous. And also you can sign up to newsletters and do all of those things. So once again, thank you all for joining us, much appreciated. We'll send a note out with some of the web addresses and some of the background information, as well as posting this on YouTube. We'll let you know in case you want to go back and take notes. Great, thank you, and have a blessed evening, everybody. Thank you.